Chapter 16 Gathering Storm. The winds carried an unnatural chill as Ava and her companions returned to the camp. The sun had barely risen, but the tension in the air made it feel as though night had never ended. Wolves moved with purpose, their faces grim as they sharpened weapons and whispered in hushed tones. The news from the scouts had reached them. The darkness wasn't just spreading, it was organizing. Xander strode ahead, his golden eyes scanning the perimeter. Luca walked beside him, his usual smirk replaced by a hardened expression. Seth trailed behind them, his movements quiet and deliberate. Ava clutched the tome tightly against her chest, its faint hum a constant reminder of the power she carried and the battles to come. "They're scared," Ava said softly, her gaze following a pair of young wolves who glanced nervously toward the forest. "They should be," Seth replied, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Fear keeps them vigilant. Complacency gets wolves killed." Xander turned to them, his voice sharp. "Fear also breeds chaos. We need to keep the pack focused. If we fall apart now, the darkness wins without a fight." Ava nodded, though a knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. The weight of the prophecy, the relentless pull of the tome, and the looming battle all pressed down on her, threatening to break her resolve. But she couldn't afford to falter now, not when so many were counting on her. They gathered in the central clearing, where Elder Mirella stood waiting. The older wolf's silver-streaked hair caught the dim light as she addressed the group, her voice steady and commanding. "The darkness is not a mindless force," Mirella said, her piercing gaze sweeping over the gathered wolves. "It adapts, it manipulates, and it preys on division. If we are to stand against it, we must be united." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ava stood at the edge of the clearing, flanked by Xander and Seth. She could feel the tension building, the doubts simmering just below the surface. Elder Rowan stepped forward, his expression cold and calculating. "Unity is a fine ideal, but we can't rely on hope alone. The Silver Wolf may be our best chance, but she's untested. Are we willing to risk everything on her?" The words stung, but Ava forced herself to stand tall. Before she could speak, Xander stepped forward, his voice ringing with authority. "Ava has proven herself time and time again," he said. "She's fought the darkness and lived. She's stronger than any of us expected, and she's willing to risk everything for this realm. Can any of you say the same?" The crowd fell silent and Rowan's eyes narrowed. Mirella stepped in, her tone firm but diplomatic. "Enough, Rowan. Doubt serves no one here. If you have a better plan, let us hear it." Rowan said nothing, his lips pressing into a thin line. Ava took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I know what's at stake," she said. "I know I haven't earned all of your trust yet, but I'm not doing this alone. Xander, Seth, Luca, all of you have fought beside me. I don't know if I'll succeed, but I do know this. If we don't stand together, we've already lost." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Mirella nodded approvingly. Rowan said nothing, but his expression remained tight with skepticism. As night fell, preparations for the coming battle intensified. Ava stood with Seth at the edge of the camp, watching as wolves armed themselves and reinforced their defenses. "They believe in you," Seth said, his voice quiet. Ava glanced at him, her silver eyes reflecting the faint light of the torches. "Do you?" Seth hesitated, then nodded. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." The answer was simple, but it steadied her more than she expected. She turned her gaze back to the camp, her resolve hardening. "Then let's make sure their belief isn't misplaced." Later that night, a scout returned, bloodied and barely able to stand. He collapsed in the clearing, and Xander rushed to his side. "What happened?" The scout's voice was weak but urgent. "The darkness. It's coming. They're massing near the sacred site. Hundreds of them, more than I've ever seen." The crowd erupted into chaos, fear spreading like wildfire. Mirella called for order, but her voice struggled to cut through the panic. Ava stepped forward, her voice rising above the din. "Enough!" The wolves stilled, their eyes turning to her. She took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. "This is what we've prepared for. We've faced the darkness before and we've survived. We will survive again, but only if we stand together." Her words seemed to steady the pack, the chaos giving way to determination. Xander rose, his hand resting on the scout's shoulder as he addressed the group. "We move at dawn," he said. "We'll meet them at the sacred site and end this before it spreads any further." Ava glanced at the tome in her hands, its glyphs glowing faintly. The whispers were quiet now, but she could feel the power building within it, waiting for the moment it would be needed most. She met Xander's gaze, her own filled with quiet determination. "We'll be ready," she said. As the camp prepared for the coming battle, Ava stood at the edge of the clearing, the wind carrying the faint scent of ash and shadow. The storm was coming, and she could feel it in her very bones, but for the first time she didn't feel afraid. She felt ready,